So where we left off was talking about the right and left atria, the left and right ventricles, and we learned about their kind of key features, which are the four chambers of the heart and unique things associated with them. Okay, I think we're ready to talk right here about the boundaries of those four chambers and how they can be examined externally via three sulci or grooves. Essentially, what that means is look on the outside of the heart. There are three little grooves, and they're not super pronounced, but they are grooves nonetheless, where you can kind of decipher where, for example, the right atrium is, and then the right ventricle is, versus the left ventricle and the left atrium. The first sulcus I'll talk about is called the coronary sulcus. Okay, it is this just little tiny depression right beneath the auricles of the atria. Remember, there's a right auricle, a left auricle. Those are the little ear-like flaps we talked about the other day. Okay, the right coronary artery is in that coronary sulcus, which, as you can see there in parentheses, is deep to the fat. So the depression is the sulcus, and actually you get a good view of it on the back side of the heart, but it is essentially covered up by this big blood vessel called the coronary sinus. Okay. So the coronary sulcus surrounds the entirety of our heart. So it goes around, okay, and it's between the two atria. Okay. Then you have an anterior interventricular sulcus and a posterior interventricular sulcus. Okay. The simplicity between the two is posterior is going to be on the back side, whereas the anterior is going to be on the front side. Okay. And as we learned, we saw this the other day, the word interventricular just simply means between the ventricles. Okay. Very easy to confuse the anterior and posterior interventricular sulcus with what we talked about last time, what we call the interventricular septum. Okay. Interventricular septum is the wall, and it's on the inside of the heart between the two ventricles. Okay. The interventricular sulci, anterior and posterior, are just the depressions. Okay, and you can see there's fat in those areas between the two ventricles. Okay, hopefully simplicity is as simple as that. Okay. Now, associated with each side of our heart are several great vessels, and you can see them very nicely in just about any picture, not this one, since that's just kind of showing part of the heart, but we can see them very nicely here on the next page and on the bottom in the posterior view. Okay. These vessels are going to bring blood to and take blood away from the heart to their respective circulations. Okay, and they're either going to be classified as an artery or as a vein. We're going to talk more about arteries and veins in our next lecture, but just kind of a background on them. Arteries are the blood vessels that take blood away from the heart, and that blood is typically rich with oxygen. So we describe it as being oxygenated, whereas veins are the blood vessels that take deoxygenated blood back to the heart. So veins carry blood to the heart, arteries away from the heart. Okay. And it's typically oxygenated blood inside arteries, and in veins, it's typically deoxygenated blood. You kind of wondered why you see in this picture and on the bottom picture red and blue colors. Okay. Red is typically used to denote blood that's rich with oxygen. Okay. So in other words, in this aorta, there is oxygenated blood, whereas the color blue is typical of deoxygenated blood. So like in this superior vena cava, which is the first one I want to talk about, it's color blue. Okay, just like the inferior vena cava, which would be right down here. Okay, the superior and inferior vena cavas are both veins, and they provide most of the blood flowing back to the heart into the right atrium. The superior vena cava brings blood from everything above the heart. So in other words, like your head and your arms, okay, upper chest and neck. And then the inferior vena cava is just everything below that. So the chest down to the tips of your toes is what is coming in via the inferior vena cava. Coronary sinus is that blood vessel I pointed out on the back side of the heart in that coronary sulcus. Notice it's shaded blue, and that is because it's a vein. Okay, this blood vessel is what we call vascular sinus. That's why it's called coronary sinus. Okay, in the coronary sulcus on the posterior surface of the heart it drains blood into the right atrium as well. So these three blood vessels are all connected to the right atrium and bring that blood into it. Okay. The superior and inferior vena cava just bring a lot more because they're a lot bigger vessels. Okay. Now the pulmonary trunk, which we can see here, is a artery that receives blood from the right ventricle. It is a short blood vessel before it comes to essentially a fork, okay, forming what we would call the right and left pulmonary arteries, okay, which let's talk about those now. Okay, they receive the blood from the pulmonary trunk, take the blood to the pulmonary circulation. We've seen this word pulmonary several times this semester. If you don't remember, pulmonary always refers to lungs. So the pulmonary trunk, pulmonary arteries are blood vessels that deliver blood to your lungs, okay? And along with the pulmonary trunk, the pulmonary arteries, and I would highlight this, are the only arteries in the body that carry deoxygenated blood, which is why, if you look here on the next page, the pulmonary trunk and the left and right pulmonary arteries are shaded blue. Okay? And that's because they're carrying the blood to the lungs to pick up oxygen. Okay? Once that blood goes through the lungs and it becomes oxygenated, it comes back to the left side of the heart via the pulmonary veins. Okay. And just like with the pulmonary arteries, this is an exception to the typical rule. And that pulmonary veins, and I will highlight this, are the only veins in the body that carry oxygenated blood, which is why if we look here on the next page, we see that they are shaded red instead of blue like every other vein would be. Okay. Last major blood vessel is the aorta, which is the artery that receives blood from the left ventricle, takes it to the systemic circulation. This is what feeds essentially us from the top of our head down to the tips of our toes. So it is a very big, think of it like the size of a garden hose. I mean, it is a big, big blood vessel. Okay, and you can see there are many branches coming off of it directly. Some of them come off indirectly. Like the left common carotid artery, you can see here, that's labeled. We'll talk about that in our next lecture, but that feeds our head and our brain. Subclavian artery there, that's going to feed your left arm, okay, and so on and so forth. It actually comes up and it arches, and that's why you see here on the next page, it's labeled as aortic arch, and then it just goes straight back down. And as you can see, we can see where it's descending down, and it's going to run almost all the way to your legs before it comes to an end where it splits to form two blood vessels that feed your legs. Okay. Now, right here, connecting the pulmonary trunk and the aorta is what we call the ligamentum arteriosum. Okay, and that's the remnant of a blood vessel called the ductus arteriosus. Okay, it is a temporary blood vessel, and it's only during fetal life that we should have this functioning that shunts blood directly from the pulmonary trunk into the aorta in order to bypass our lungs. So we talked about one of the two lung bypasses the other day. That was what we called the foramen ovale, which then closes and becomes the fossa ovalis. That's one of the two. The other is this structure here. Essentially, it closes off and just becomes like a connective tissue. Essentially, it's looks like a scar that's left over when that blood vessel closes. We call it the ligamentum arteriosum when it becomes that scar, but in fetal life, once again, when we're not breathing our own oxygen and carbon dioxide out, we don't need to deliver as much blood to the lungs, so we don't need to send all that blood to the lungs, so we bypass it. And this is one of those two bypasses. As far as these two images go, I'm not really worried about them. This is kind of cool to see those different structures and whatnot from a real cadaver. But the two images on the next page are definitely images that you're going to want to know. So let's highlight the following. It's not going to be everything. So I'll start here on the left side of the image, which actually will be the right side of the heart. Superior vena cava. Anytime you see aorta in this picture, I just, in the same thing here, the bottom, just aorta is fine. So aorta here, aortic arch, just aorta is fine. Descending aorta is aorta fine. And we'll get into like the different parts of the aorta in our next lecture. Okay. So aorta, right pulmonary artery, right pulmonary veins, auricle of right atrium, or as we would just commonly call it, right auricle, coronary sulcus, right ventricle, and inferior vena cava. On the right side of the image here, once again, aorta is fine. Ligamentum arteriosum, left pulmonary artery, pulmonary trunk, left pulmonary veins, left auricle, left atrium, left ventricle, anterior interventricular sulcus. So that's the anterior view. On the back side, remember how I talked about the heart is kind of reclining, where the top of it kind of points more backwards. That's what we're getting a good view of here. Get a good view of the two atria and the blood vessels that we just talked about. So here's what you need to know. Just aorta here for both of these is fine. Okay. The left pulmonary artery, left pulmonary veins, left atrium, coronary sinus. But also make sure you know that's where the coronary sulcus is, just covered up by the sinus. So make sure you highlight all of that. Left ventricle and then the posterior interventricular sulcus. Over on the right, superior vena cava, aorta, right pulmonary artery, right pulmonary veins, right atrium, inferior vena cava, and right ventricle. You can pretty much bank on at least one of those two images being on the exam, if not both of them, at least one of them for sure. And that includes another image, which is just like the one that we looked at here, but in another internal view where we can get a good view of the 4 heart valves that I promised we would talk about. And I mentioned just briefly the other day. All right, in addition to cardiac muscle tissue, the heart wall also contains dense connective tissue, forming what we call the fibrous skeleton of the heart. Okay, the fibrous skeleton consists of 4 dense connective tissue rings that surround the heart valves, fuse with one another, and merge with the interventricular septum. Okay, if we look down here at the bottom images, we have surrounding each of these 4 heart valves, as you can see, specialty ring. Okay, pulmonary fibrous ring, right atrioventricular ring, aortic fibrous ring, left atrioventricular ring. That's from the kind of cartoonistic version. Here from a cadaver, you can see those rings and their associated valves. I'm not really too concerned about the rings, but I wanted to mention them. Nonetheless, I'm more concerned with the valves. Okay. Now, in addition to forming a structural foundation for those heart valves, the skeleton prevents overstretching of those valves, serves as a point of insertion for the bundles of cardiac muscle fibers, and acts as an electrical insulator between the atria and the ventricle. So it enables the atria to contract and prevents the ventricles from contracting at the same time, which is very, very important. So that blood is always going forward. And speaking of, that relates to the 4 heart valves. And so let's read and continue on. As each chamber of the heart contracts, it pushes a volume of blood into a ventricle or out of the heart into an artery. Valves will open and close in response to pressure changes as the heart contracts and relaxes. And this is going to help ensure that blood flow is a one-directional situation, preventing retrograde or backwards flow. Okay. There are 4 heart valves, and they are either classified as atrioventricular valves, or AV valves for short, or semilunar valves, or SL valves for short. The first 2 valves we'll talk about are the AV valves. We call them the atrioventricular valves because they are located between an atrium and a ventricle. Atrioventricular, straight forward as can be. Their job is to prevent blood from flowing back into the atria when our ventricles are contracting or going through what we call systole. Now, associated with these 2 valves are specialty features called chordae tendineae, or chordae tendineae, however you pronounce that. Okay, you've probably heard the phrase like pulling at your heartstrings before. We literally actually have heartstrings, and that's what these structures are. They are attached to muscles on the floor of our ventricles. We call those muscles papillary muscles. You can see them here in our animated version, and this is a real deal version. Okay, those muscles contract and pull on those heartstrings, and they prevent the valves from flipping inside out, which would allow the blood to go back up and into an atrium when the ventricles contract. So they essentially, once again, prevent blood from going backwards. Okay. The two atrioventricular valves are the valves we did mention the other day, the tricuspid and bicuspid, which is what I usually call them. And they're named that way because of the number of flaps or cusps that they have. And hopefully everybody knows by now, but if you didn't, tri means 3, 1, 2, 3 flaps, and bi means 2, 1, 2. Okay. The tricuspid valve is located between the right atrium and the right ventricle, and it's easy for me to remember tricuspid's on the right side because there's R in the word tricuspid and there's R at the beginning of right. Okay. Whereas the bicuspid valve is on the left side of the heart between the left atrium and left ventricle. You can see they are labeled here differently though, as what we would call the right AV valve, or right atrioventricular valve, and the left atrioventricular valve. Okay, so they do go by different terms. There's also a third term to describe the bicuspid valve. This is like the oldest, I believe, traditional term, what's called the mitral valve. Okay. I'm going to actually make sure you want you to know all of those names. So make sure you know tricuspid, right AV valve are the same, bicuspid, mitral, left AV valve are the same as well. Okay. Then you've got the two semilunar valves. You get a good view here of the pulmonary valve, which is located between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk. Okay, this is what opens up to allow blood to leave the right ventricle and go into the pulmonary trunk and pulmonary arteries. Then you don't quite see as well here, but it is right there, the aortic valve, which is between the left ventricle and the aorta, and therefore allows blood to leave the left ventricle to go into the aorta to then be delivered to all the tissues of the body. So your semilunar valves are located in the outflow tract or exit point of each ventricle, prevents the blood from going back into the heart after it's left. Okay. Now, heart valve damage can occur, includes what we call stenosis, which is where the valves kind of struggle to open up, and then insufficiency, where it's not going to close properly. Okay, so it's a little bit leaky. Typically, damage includes both stenosis and insufficiency, and would be treated by simply, and I say simply, I mean it's still heart surgery, but the valve is replaced, and they kind of do one of two things to replace the valve in the heart. They can either use a mechanical heart valve, which is cool, but I think is also even cooler than that. They'll transplant pig hearts, pig heart valves. So that's kind of cool. But those are your heart valves. As far as this image goes, you can almost bet $100 million that you'll see this on the exam when we do have it. So make sure you know it. What do you need to know? Well, let's find out. So once again, just aorta is fine. Superior vena cava, right pulmonary artery, right pulmonary veins, auricle of right atrium, pulmonary valve. There's that depression that's left over after it closes, known as the fossa vallis. So I want you to highlight that. But you know the right atrium, where a lot of that stuff's located. Don't worry about the openings there next. Right atrioventricular valve, and I would write off to the side or in parentheses tricuspid valve. Like I said, I want you to know it both ways. And then right ventricle and inferior vena cava. Okay, on the left side of the heart, starting on top, the aorta or aortic arch. Ligamentum arteriosum, and actually just looking, everything on this side would be fair game. And then once again, just like with the tricuspid valve, make sure you know left AV valve is the bicuspid and mitral valve. So if you need to write that down on the side or next to it, might not be a bad idea. Also, like if you had this image on the exam and it was blank and I asked you to label chordae tendineae, whatever, Okay, those are the strings. That's over here as well. So you don't necessarily have to do it in the left ventricle. Same thing for the papillary muscles. Here they are on the right side. And then the trabeculae carneae, remember those are these little ridges on the inside of your ventricles that we talked a little bit about the other day that help increase pressure inside the heart and then help with ejecting it more forcefully. Okay, any questions here? As far as the images at the bottom, you don't really need to worry about those. All right, so now that you know all the different structures associated with the heart, whether it's the heart or the blood vessels attached to it, okay, we can kind of be able to trace where that blood flows in and out. And now we would have to think here in postnatal or after birth circulation, because this is when we start pumping blood into both the systemic circulation, that's what feeds everything from our head to our toes, and then the pulmonary circulation, which is what our right side pumps to and delivers that oxygen or delivers the blood so it can get oxygenated in our lungs. Okay. Left side is what pumps to the systemic circulation, pumping bright red oxygenated blood to the aorta. Right side pumps the deoxygenated blood into the pulmonary circulation, and this involves the pulmonary trunk, which then branches to the pulmonary arteries that carry the blood into the lungs. Looking down here at the bottom, we kind of have two different figures, an illustration of the heart, just like kind of what we saw on the previous page, but we've got some numbers. And then over here, it just shows the cycle, we just kind of them labeled out. So it all begins, we just start essentially with the right atrium, receiving blood by way of the superior, the inferior vena cavas, plus the coronary sinus. From there, it's pumped down through the tricuspid or right atrioventricular valve into the right ventricle. Right ventricle contracts, pushes that drop of blood out of it through the pulmonary valve into the pulmonary trunk, which then branches to form the pulmonary arteries. Then the blood goes into the lungs where gas exchange occurs. O2 is picked up, CO2 is unloaded, and therefore is going to be breathed out. Blood comes back in. Now it's oxygenated blood. That's why we see it's shaded red by way of the pulmonary veins into the left atrium. From the left atrium, blood goes down into left ventricle through the bicuspid, the mitral or left atrioventricular valve, all the same thing. Then it's ejected out of the ventricle, left ventricle, into the aorta through the aortic valve right there to be delivered to all of our structures of the body, where we then can perform systemic gas exchange. So O2 leaves the blood, goes into our tissues, CO2 enters the blood, and then we start the whole process over again with the blood coming back to the right atrium by way of those same three blood vessels. And as you guys can see, I can do that pretty quickly. I don't expect you guys to be able to do that as quickly. What I would recommend though, because there will be questions on the exam related to this, study this up and then see if you can write these 10 steps out. And take a blank piece of paper and test yourself out. If you can do that, you're gonna be in great shape. And then, you know, next time you're around your family or at Easter when you're having dinner, you can do it for everybody and sound like the biggest nerd on earth. But maybe you'll impress somebody and then think you're so smart. There will be questions on the exam, you know, for example, like blood in the right atrium travels through which valve to get to the right ventricle? Or, you know, blood is in the left ventricle, what blood vessel receives the blood? So it'll be like multiple choice style questions, but you'll want to make sure you can tie everything together with the valves, the vessels, and all that wonderful stuff we've been talking here the last couple class periods. As far as those images go, you don't really need to worry about them though. So just the info. All right, let's talk about the delivery of blood to and from the heart. Okay. Keep in mind that the blood inside the heart is not going to stay put in there long enough for nutrients to diffuse quickly from the blood into feeding the chambers of the heart. Okay. In other words, those three layers, the endo, the myo, the epicardium of the heart, made up of living cells needing nutrients, producing waste, they need delivery of blood. Well, the blood that's inside the heart, it's not there long enough for exchange to occur. Okay. So for this reason, the myocardium, especially because that's the thickest layer, has its own network of blood vessels. Okay. We call this network the coronary or cardiac circulation. Okay. It involves coronary arteries, coronary capillaries, coronary veins. Okay. Capillaries are the blood vessels where gas exchange actually occurs and nutrients are exchanged as well. But they're microscopic, so we don't have any pictures that will show those off. But what we can see here on the left side of the page is all the various coronary arteries on the right side, the coronary veins. Notice what color they are shaded. The red color, once again, is oxygenated arteries, and blue here for the veins. Down here at the bottom are a couple views, an anterior and a posterior view of some cadaver hearts, where they've actually injected the arteries and veins with a nice red dye for the arteries and a blue dye for the veins, so you can tell them apart, which is really, really cool. Okay. Let's first talk about the coronary arteries. Those are the first branches that come off of the aorta. Okay. In fact, if I zoom in, okay, here is where the aorta begins. There are two branches coming off of it almost instantly. What we have is a left coronary artery and a right coronary artery that feed the right and left sides of the heart, respectively. Now, as you can see, there are several branches coming off of those. Those are the very first two branches, okay? And they're going to feed the myocardium and supply the myocytes or muscle fibers with oxygen nutrients. And blood flows into these coronary arteries best when our heart is relaxed, because when it's contracting, that force and the speed at which the blood's flowing is just really, really tremendous. Okay. Now the heart will contain many what we call anastomoses, which is where you see connections between branches of the coronary arteries. And this allows the heart muscle to receive sufficient oxygen, even if there's an artery that's partially, blocked. So like if you have a blockage here, there might be a connection from there over, so that this part of our heart is not, losing, the blood flow. Okay. Now, if a blockage is severe enough and it completely is blocked or cessation of it, we call this a myocardial infarction, which I've mentioned before, is the fancy term for a heart attack or a coronary. And if it lasts more than a few minutes, death of the heart muscle will result. And if severe enough, it would cause, overall death of the individual, because then their heart's not working. Okay. Between the two, any guesses as which coronary artery would be most lethal, the right or the left? Try again.
I'd say right as lungs as well.
Okay, well, let's think about it this way. Remember, the left ventricle is that biggest chamber, right? It feeds everything, which includes your brain. So if you're not pumping blood out into the aorta, your brain's not getting that blood flow. Okay, they call a heart attack where this is the blood vessel, especially this what we call anterior interventricular branch, and they call those widowmakers for a reason. And they're extremely, extremely deadly. After blood passes through the arteries, it flows into the coronary capillaries, where the oxygen nutrients are delivered to the heart muscle, and the carbon dioxide and the waste are collected. And then the blood is going to flow back into the right atrium by way of the coronary veins. Okay, these are the blood vessels that drain the deoxygenated blood after the exchange has occurred, most of which drains into that coronary sinus that we have already talked about. So on the back side of the heart, so they kind of are showing it a little bit transparently here because it's on the back side, and this is an anterior view. But that connects directly to the right atrium. And we've already mentioned this before, but the coronary sinus is a large vascular sinus on the back side of the heart. As far as these images go, you don't need to worry about them. In our next lecture, which we'll be getting to, we'll be identifying them, and we're going to color things so that it's a little bit easier. When you have everything in red or everything in blue, it's kind of harder to focus in and tell them apart. But once you get them all colored in, it'll help tremendously. All right, let's talk a little bit about the histology of your cardiac muscle cells and the muscle tissue. So in other words, we're going to talk a little bit about kind of the structural makeup of the tissue itself. Okay. And we can kind of think back to when we talked about skeletal muscle fibers. We previously talked about those pretty in depth. Okay. Compared to skeletal muscle fibers, cardiac muscle fibers are shorter in length and less circular and transverse section. Okay. We saw in cardiac muscle, or excuse me, in skeletal muscle fibers that they were long thread-like structures, basically running the entire length of the entire muscle, whereas cardiac muscle fibers are really short, and sometimes they have kind of a branching feature to them, okay? And that gives them a more of a stair-step appearance, okay? Typically, they're about 50 to 100 microns in length and then have a diameter of about 14 microns. Unlike skeletal muscle fibers, which were multinucleated, okay? Cardiac muscle fibers are uninucleated, so there's only one nucleus per cell, and the nucleus is typically kind of on the inside, whereas in skeletal muscle fibers, the nucleus was underneath of and really close to the plasma membrane. Okay. The ends of cardiac muscle fibers connect to neighboring fibers by irregular transverse thickenings in the sarcolemma. We call them intercalated discs, and we mentioned those, and we've seen pictures like the picture of cardiac muscle under a microscope, okay? And it looked like just like a dark band. Okay? Well, intercalated discs have three special features. The first two, interdigitating folds and desmosomes, just enable the cells to connect really strongly to one another. The interdigitating folds are just like these zigzagged connections, so it enables the cells to kind of lock together like a puzzle piece, locks in with another puzzle piece. So there's a lot of intercellular contact. There's a lot of increased surface area. Okay. Whereas desmosomes, those are a special type of cell junction. Think of those like little pieces, or like how you can weld two pieces of metal together to like little welds that hold the cells together really tightly. And that way, when the cells are contracting and pulling on one another, they're not just ripping apart. Okay. We've also got what we call gap junctions, which are a really important feature that is fairly unique. Basically, they're like open doorways between neighboring cells that allow ions to flow from cell to cell. And this is what enables those cells to all become excited and contract at the same time, or contract in what we'd say is unison, which is what is very important in the heart, so that, for example, both atria are contracting in the exact same instant while the ventricles are relaxed, and then the ventricles contract in unison while the atria are relaxed. So it's very, very important to increase efficiency of contraction. As far as other things, mitochondria are more numerous and larger in cardiac muscle fibers than you see in skeletal muscle fibers. They take up about 25% of the cytosolic space in the cardiac muscle fibers, whereas they only took up about 2% in skeletal muscle. That demonstrates the fact that cardiac muscle fibers really prefer to make their ATP using oxygen, what we would call aerobic respiration. Looking down at the bottom of the page, we see the structure known as a sarcomere with the same things that we've previously learned about, like Z discs, M lines, I bands, A bands, and so on and so forth. They are just like what we've previously learned about with skeletal muscle fibers. You also see T-tubes and sarcoplasmic reticulum. Although the sarcoplasmic reticulum was a little bit smaller, we don't have as many T-tubes, but they all function the exact same way that they do in skeletal muscle fibers that we've previously talked about. And for that reason, I don't really think we need to spend any more time or worry about the images on this page, especially this one. We've already essentially seen it before when we talked about skeletal muscle. So we'll move on, and our final slide here will be focusing in on what we call the cardiac conduction system, which is a very, very important set of structures. All right. About 1% of the cardiac muscle fibers or myocytes in our heart are autorhythmic, which means that they are essentially more like a neuron and less like a muscle fiber. Okay. Instead of contracting, they depolarize spontaneously at regular time intervals and thus are capable of generating an action potential just like our neurons are. Okay. These cells are what constitute the cardiac conduction system, which controls the route and the timing of electrical conduction in the heart. So essentially, all nerve signaling originates in the heart and is conducted through these 5 different structures. It all begins with what we commonly will just shortly call the SA node, which is short for sino or sinuatrial node. It has always been sinoatrial node. I don't really know why they've kind of changed it to sinuatrial node. Okay, but the sinoatrial node, as you can see, I have it listed up here at the top, is a patch of modified myocytes in the right atrium near the epicardium, or under the epicardium near the superior vena cava. Okay, this is what we would commonly call our pacemaker, and I would highlight that because this is where the original signal that triggers each heartbeat to occur. Okay, when it depolarizes, it creates an action potential, and you can see these purple arrows that not only travels through the right atrium where it's located, but also across and into the left atrium, and what results is contraction of both of those atria at the same time, and that we would call atrial contraction or atrial systole. Okay. Now, because of the structural makeup of the heart, and a lot of it's because of the fibrous skeleton, and the only place for that signal to travel into the ventricles is through these structures here, which includes the next node, the only other node, what we call the AV node or atrioventricular node. Okay. It is located near the tricuspid valve at the lower end of the interatrial septum. Okay. And then from there, everything's connected. It has attached to the backside of it what we call the AV bundle or bundle of His, which carries the signal downwards. And then as you can see, it comes to a point where it splits, forming what we call right and left bundle branches. Okay. These bundle branches travel down through that interventricular septum towards the apex of the heart, and then traveling up through both walls of the ventricles are what we call the Purkinje fibers, okay, which is the traditional term. This is, I believe, the first time I've seen it this way in this newer version of the textbook, what's described as the subendocardial conducting network. To me, and I would write it down here at the bottom, I want you to know as Purkinje fibers. Okay. I guess I'm just resistant. I want you to, instead of having it listed here 5, I'd put down in parentheses or label it Purkinje fibers. These are what trigger both ventricles to contract at the same time and then eject the blood out of the heart. Okay. As far as this image goes, make sure you know those 5 things. Okay. And once again, you know, the Purkinje fibers is number 5, what I would label. Okay. So. All right, any questions?